let's introduce the panel, and they can talk about their valuable experience developing renewable energy projects in a nature positive way. So first, I'll introduce Neil. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much, Harvie. Neil Titley from AECOM. I'm the battery and solar and battery sector lead for AECOM. So we're an environmental and engineering company, so we're predominantly in the NSIP market. So a lot of what we do is working on those solar farms that are a little bit of feedback there. Working on the solar farms that tend to be over 250 megawatt in size. We're currently working on 16 of those projects across the country, but also some of the smaller scale solar and the rooftop solar as well. I have worked as well on some of the wind farms across Scotland and Wales and a little bit in England. But some of those wind farm projects are slightly more dated because of the change in the market regime. Thank you.
Perfect, thanks Neil. And Rosalind, going down the line.
Hello. Firstly, I'm finding this whole experience amazing. I can see everybody, but not hear anyone. Right. I work at Quimbrook Infrastructure Partners. I'm a senior director in the investment team. We invest in the infrastructure needed to deliver the energy transition. That's in the US, the UK, and Australia. In the UK, we're currently the only people to have broken ground on a solar NSIP, so that's Cleve Hill, which is very near the end stages of construction now. We're also going to be breaking ground on our next solar NSIP, Mallard Pass, which will be located in Lincolnshire, Rutland area. We have definitely used learnings from projects over in America on our biodiversity approach. So in America, we even have desert tortoise superhighways. If anyone ever thought a tortoise needed to go at super speed, they do need their own roadway. And I can tell you all about how at Cleve Hill we've been approaching biodiversity to seek to deliver a 67% positive impact. And we're targeting greater than 70% at Mallard.
All right, thanks Rosalind. And on the end there, Tris.
Yeah, thanks Harvie, and hello, good afternoon everyone. It's nice to have this opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Tris Allenson. I'm a senior conservation scientist at BirdLife International. For those of you unfamiliar with BirdLife, we're one of the world's largest conservation NGOs, but we're structured slightly differently. We're a partnership of national conservation NGOs. So BirdLife in the UK is the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and we have around the world 123 similar national NGOs, often with a focus on birds, but often more widely a focus on their country's nature in general, and collectively they make up the BirdLife partnership. At BirdLife, I lead our science work on understanding the impacts of energy infrastructure on birds and working with the energy sector to find solutions. So I work around the world with energy developers, governments, and the lenders who are financing the projects to find ways to make energy projects bird and nature safe.
Perfect, thanks. So to open the discussion, so I talked a little bit at the start about design and management for biodiversity. So before going into the more sort of bespoke enhancements and things, I thought maybe we'd start by talking about how to reduce the impact on biodiversity of solar and wind projects, and perhaps I'll go down the line again, so starting with you, Neil.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe if we start with solar, because the number of solar projects that are on the go at the moment. I mean, Rosalind touched on it really, and the success that solar projects do deliver. Some really good numbers in the biodiversity net gain in the market, and we've seen projects varying really anywhere between typically down at sort of 30%, let's say, biodiversity net gain, up to sort of over 100% biodiversity net gain. And some of those larger scale projects, the nationally significant infrastructure projects we've worked on, are well up there in those numbers. So at AECOM, we delivered Sonica Energy Farm, which is down in Cambridgeshire and Suffolk, and Longfield Solar Farm in Essex. They were the first couple, and they were up in the 80%, so really similar number. And they do that through a variety of ways. Some of these things just come along naturally because you're effectively taking high-intensity farmland and converting that effectively to an ecological park, but it's an energy generation ecological park. So you can create quite high-quality grassland seed mixes under the solar PV. You can introduce a nice wildflower meadow mix. There's different seed mixes, so you've got a different variety of options there that you can introduce. And often there's mitigation areas as well that may be required for landscaping. It may be actually for bird mitigation. There's lots of different factors. Sometimes land set aside for archaeology, and that gives an opportunity as well to especially enhance those areas. So you can do quite a lot of enhancement under those panels and bring different types of species in, and mix that really with some of the measures around the perimeter of the site. So we have that stock fencing, which allows the smaller mammals to pass between. Some of the solar farms we've worked on as well have mammal gates as well to allow things like the badger and some of the smaller creatures, maybe it's the rabbits, if they don't burrow underneath the stock fencing to move under those gaps. So they're naturally beginning with quite a high quality biodiversity net gain under those panels. And then as part of the mitigation strategies, in the UK, we tend to like to hide solar, and we hide it quite well. I've worked on some of the international projects, and they don't do that internationally. They like to have it visible as a bit of a PR for when people go past that site. It's a different approach in a lot of countries, but here we like to hide it, and that has an added benefit of the hedges as well. So some of those projects, we just had East Yorkshire Solar Farm consented, and that was about 15 kilometres of new hedge, and it's a vast amount. That's some of these sites, the nationally significant infrastructure projects, they're 600, 1,500 hectares. They're of that order. So by the time you put up the mitigation for glint and glare or landscaping, block those views in, you get a tremendous amount of hedges as well, which adds to that biodiversity net gain.
And just in case not everyone's familiar, it's already come up a few times, probably come up a lot more. Biodiversity net gain is the government policy where all developments have to not only replace the damage, but achieve an additional statutory 10% on the baseline biodiversity that existed there in the first place. And as Neil's saying, for solar farms in particular, planting some wildflower mix can achieve far beyond 10% quite easily, or hedgerows and things like that. So solar's in a great position to be able to benefit from biodiversity net gain. Sorry, Rosalind.
Well, I was going to actually bring that point up, which is why? Why are we doing biodiversity net gain? Why are we caring? And I think it comes from, well, firstly, you just pointed out, it's now government regulation for infrastructure. Although the incumbent Labour government are consulting now on rowing that back for smaller developments, which is going to impact the value of a BNG credit. I would have highlighted to people that this is because Glasgow's COP was the very first to set out nature as a key consideration internationally. So it was only in 2021 that the Congress of Parties brought that together, and it was included in the overarching statement. Although, if I've said that with lots of authority and someone would like to prove to me that it was mentioned at Copenhagen, just correct me and I'll do a correction. I would then say it's because we can now cost economically what our impact on nature is. The Oxford University has said it's a $5 trillion impact if we continue to get nature wrong. And you can say that's globally, that's a big number globally. What's that number here in the UK? It's a 12% negative impact to GDP within a generation from getting nature wrong. So that tells you now we can put the economic numbers on it, investors care. So if investors care and you're developing a project and not considering your impact on nature, you're making your project that much less investable or less desirable to an investor who is going to come along and look to build your project. So it's also now a consideration where you need to have both how do I minimize my negative impact, how do I address a legal requirement to look at my impact of nature, but also how do I make the projects that I am seeking to develop the ones that investors want to invest in, the ones that lenders want to lend to, because they are concerned about their overall impact and the overall strength of the returns that your project can deliver.
Thanks, Rosalind. And then Tris from BirdLife International. Maybe you can give us a more international perspective on how developers or developments can reduce their impact.
Yeah, so I think, as I can provide a sort of global perspective, it might be worth sort of outlining why this does present a significant global challenge. And there are three main components to that. Firstly, in order to transition to a renewable future, we need to find a very large area for wind and solar. So whilst the footprint of these technologies is a lot lighter than traditional forms of energy production, They do require a larger area, and it is a significant amount of the world's land and sea that needs to be found to use for wind and for solar. And indeed, it's been calculated that if we were just to put those sites in the areas with the greatest resource, so basically the wind farms where it's windiest and the solar panels where the greatest solar irradiation, then that would require about 11 million hectares of nature, including 3 million hectares of key biodiversity areas. These are the most important places for sustaining life on Earth. And not only would it take it would take that huge area of nature, but it would be counterproductive, because in utilising that natural land, which is doing a job of sequestering carbon, you would be releasing, it is estimated, over 400 million tonnes of carbon. So we have to. So there is a risk involved in where we choose to locate wind and solar facilities. The second issue is that to achieve this transition is going to require a huge amount of new grid infrastructure. There's already 80 million kilometres of power line in the world. That's enough power line to go to the moon and back 200 times. And it's suggested that by 2040, that will have had to double to accommodate our transition to renewables. So we need to double the amount of power line, another 80 million kilometres by 2040. And birds in particular are affected by power lines. It's difficult to come up with a rough estimate, but it would probably be conservative to say, average globally, you're looking at about five fatalities per kilometre of power line per year. So in a world where we've doubled the amount of power line infrastructure, by 2040, we're looking at 1 billion birds dying annually because of collision or electrocution on power lines. And to put that into perspective, the worst ever oil disaster for bird fatalities was the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which is believed to have resulted in about 800,000 bird fatalities. So you're looking at a situation that by 2040, you could have 1,000 Deepwater Horizon events in terms of magnitude of fatality of birds every year just by the global grid infrastructure. And then the third way it impacts is that all this new wind and solar facilities and power lines is going to require a huge amount more materials and metals. So a lot more steel, aluminium, copper, steel, etc. And then for sort of battery storage and other elements of electrification, a lot more lithium, cobalt, etc. And often the environmental circumstances around the mining of these metals is often quite poor environmental standards and indeed quite poor human rights standards. So collectively those three elements do present a sizable global challenge.
Is there a way we can achieve an energy transition with all of that considered?
Well, yes. I mean, this is why I think, whilst that sounded like quite a bleak prognosis, if you ask me, is renewable energy bad for nature? The answer is, well, it depends, and it depends on us. So we've heard the kind of examples of where you can, if you choose a landscape correctly, a landscape of relatively low biodiversity importance already, such as the sort of intensively managed monocultures of southern England, and then do biodiversity enhancement around that, you can actually have a net positive impact. And my partners at the RSPB have just released a paper with Cambridge University that has shown that solar facilities in their subject area of East Anglia are, on balance, a net positive biodiversity influence to the countryside. So it can be done, and a lot of it comes down to that siting, choosing the right locations. The great thing about wind and solar is these are ubiquitous resources. There is a lot of wind out there, a lot of solar out there, and most countries, whilst it's a large area they need to find, it's probably 2 to 3% of their land and sea area. And we can find areas that are of lower biodiversity value to prioritise the development of those things. So the first thing is about choosing the right site, and one thing we've done at BirdLife is to develop spatial tools. We have a tool called Avistep, the avian sensory tool for energy planning, which we developed for a number of countries around the world and continue to expand. We're currently working on Australia. And this tool, we map the extent of sensitivity of birds across the country two different types of energy infrastructure, to wind on and offshore, to solar, PV, and to power lines, both high voltage transmission lines and lower voltage distribution lines, different methodologies for each. At a fine resolution, which we then overlay with resource availability, wind and solar availability, making it very easy for planners and developers to see those areas that have suitable resource potential, but actually have low environmental impact and which should be prioritised for development. And so, in the first instance, it's about getting the siting right, and then it's about doing the kind of things that we'll go on to discuss about making sites even more sort of nature.
And part of that siting is also maximising and utilising the grid infrastructure that already exists in the most efficient way as well. So we've spoken a little bit about how to what the potential impacts are and how to mitigate for those impacts. But I want to move on to sort of more bespoke, sort of real wins for nature positive solar and wind developments. Maybe starting here again, Neil.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, just thinking aloud, and maybe we'll sort of evolve the conversation as we go through this. But from a solar side, again, if we focus on that first, there's quite a cluster that's developed in Lincolnshire, of course. So lots of people have been focusing on the negative attributes of cumulative impacts in Lincolnshire with the scale and the number of solar farms, the amount of land in that particular county that's planned for solar PV. I guess the interesting side of that is we are also in conversation with Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, who were quite quick and positive jumping onto this in terms of the potential that they saw bringing solar PV across their county and the opportunities it could bring. And they were quite quick at bringing the different developers together, quite quick at bringing the councils together, and their thinking behind that was twofold. I mean, firstly, obviously from a resource point of view, they were giving the same, very similar comments on multiple applications, and they just wanted to see a little bit of consistency. They wanted to pick the best features from the particular applications they'd seen and try and roll that across. And my colleagues in ACOM were trying to do that, work with them to identify what they saw as the good practice, the best practice for their county, and apply that to the various solar farms. But they were trying to roll that out as a time-saving mechanism and apply a little bit of consistency to get the best that they could. So that's been really positive, and I know a lot of developers continuing to work with the Wildlife Trust there.
So that's a bit on Tris's point earlier on sort of grid infrastructure. So that's in Lincolnshire. I think it's a gas power station that shut down. So there's a big grid connection there. So there's a lot of applications maximising that grid connection, but then working together to find sort of synergies of nature benefit across multiple developments. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, Lincolnshire and other counties as well are also benefiting from new upgrades to the national grid. So it's National Grid proposing more overhead lines, new substations, and they bring in the capacity. So some of these developments are connecting to future substations that will be built. But interestingly, a lot of these solar and the wind developments, not all of them, but a lot of them in England have been buried cables. So that helps, I guess, Tris, from your point of view. Overhead cables provide, they present an obstacle to birds, and you start thinking about that collision risk and the height and how you defend against that. Much of the projects that we work on, it is a buried cable. The downside to that, of course, is it can be a lot more costly. You can have complex crossings. You can sometimes have to interact with watercourses. So it sometimes brings in other challenges, and sometimes you can overcome that by horizontal directional drilling underneath and going several meters under the watercourses, for example. So you keep to the more sterile land. You're avoiding the sensitivities on the surface or near the surface. So that provides an option. There are some other developments that are coming forward still with the overhead lines. So sometimes it's not always practical to do the buried solution if the ground conditions are not right. If there's just a lot of ditches and drainage courses and it's just crossing after crossing, the ground conditions aren't suitable, it may not be the right solution. But predominantly in the industry, a lot of them have been the buried cables, which in England, in the UK, I know internationally it's probably less so for your work, Tris, but it has avoided some of those impacts.
Okay, great. And Rosalind?
Okay, learnings. So learnings and what are the positive impacts? That question.
Yeah. Moving on from impacts and more sort of innovative approaches that have been produce real benefits for nature.
So usually I'm a big believer in don't reinvent the wheel. But when it comes to how you're going to address your particular site's biodiversity baseline and then how to improve it, the method of the assessment, don't reinvent the wheel, but do not treat one site fits all in terms of your solutions, because the nuances of a project that is trying to get a consent and it's grade 1 land, grade 1, best and most versatile, is not going to be the same site considerations that you have for a project that is grade 5, effectively a brownfield. So I would then say you need to have the joy of developing in England is we've gone through 4 iterations and have got a fairly standard way of assessing the base level of biodiversity at a project. And you know it's got to be pretty good because they seem to have adopted that formula with a few localised nuances in Scotland. And again, it's also being referenced by projects in Wales. So we have at least got a standard base for how we can assess a project. Before we came on, I did glibly say you also have to get an independent to assess what's the best way to improve your site's diversity. We have a project in Wales with compost boxes to encourage grass snakes. I would not choose to have grass snakes at a site, but it was very good for the biodiversity improvement at that site to encourage grass snakes into the area. So I do site visits very carefully at that project.
That's just personally you wouldn't like to be working around snakes, is it?
Personally, less snake keen. I think they do wonderful things. But the proximity of me and a snake is something I like to keep very big.
That's how you're similar to Indiana Jones.
Yes, I like that. Yes, I'm the Indiana Jones of the energy transition. Yes, I could lean in. So that would be another learning. Don't prescribe. I've done a wildflower mix at X. I'll do a wildflower mix at Y. You actually have to make. Should I be improving the water courses? Should I be improving the hedgerows, thickness and depth? Should I be improving? We've put in bat breeding centres at pillboxes. We're using local site features to actually improve local site biodiversity. I mean, avian runways, did you ever think you'd need one of those? Yes, on a big solar project with an east-west array like we have at Cleve Hill, we've had to introduce avian runways so that the birds don't get glare. And those are all of the type of very specific site nuances that you need to consider. But I would definitely say factor in what your base level is. It goes back to that point about site selection, because there are some who say you should never do off-site improvement. You must do everything at the site. To which I would say, if we're taking grade 1 productive land out of food use, which doesn't feel great when it comes to food security and food price inflation risk, etc., then we actually want to minimise the land take from grade 1. So you do just the bare minimum. If it's a wind turbine, you can farm productively underneath wind turbines. So the land take is much smaller for a wind project than it is for solar. But again, you should then be allowed to do off-site biodiversity improvements because you don't want to increase that land resource or drain from grade 1. And I think that's where we really have to think of best practices and what can really work for each individual project.
Yeah, it's another one of those site selection issues at the very beginning. What is a bird runway? Out of curiosity, is it just a
an
space
avian runway is actually just a gap.
Just a space in between the panels.
I would say that in front of us is an avian runway. If that was the east-west panel and that was the east-west panel, it is because we're used to south-facing panels here in the UK where it's panel gap, panel gap, panel gap. On east-west, it almost looks like the rooftops. And you have them going in a zigzag very, very close together. Your benefit is you have a far less peaky solar generation. So we're already seeing in the UK negative power prices at weekends due to the amount of solar generating at a weekend in May, because May was very high for irradiation. So if we're already seeing that with our current level of solar generation, we're expecting to add from our 16 gigawatts potentially to get up to 45 gigawatts if the government were to hit their CP30 targets. Big if. Now imagine what that will do to power prices in the daytime. So there'll be a lot of excess electricity from south facing. It's a bit like, they call it flattening the shoulders. When you have east-west, you generate more in the morning and the evening, but you don't have as high maximum daytime generation. You do, however, have a more concentrated panel layout. So then you have to work quite carefully with what you can do in terms of grass improvement or grazing, because the density of your panel layout means that you do then provide very little light for grass growth underneath the panels. But that can work out better for wildflower planting and things like that.
So has there been something to mitigate the lack of sunlight and water hitting?
You just have to choose a different sort of mitigation. So that's where, again, I'm saying if you've got a plan for south-facing fixed tilt panels, and you were saying, we can do X, Y, Z different grasses or wildflowers, it doesn't work to apply dogmatically that same mitigation to an east-west array or to what's happening now a lot in the UK, tracker. So a lot of projects are going into planning and getting a tracker approval. That, again, will have a different mitigation compared to fixed tilt.
So that'll be panels that will either follow the sun or seasonally tilt
Yeah,
up.
so then you're getting a single access tracker and your dual access tracker, and for many people they're going, what on earth is the supply chain for the OE, like the equipment and the O&M? Well, if you look at the volume of NSIPs that have gone in just on a tracker, so Mallard Pass has what's called the Rochdale envelope, so we can, in final design, pick between fixed tilt and tracker. A lot of projects are going into the NSIP process committed to the tracker, therefore there will have to be a substantial improvement in tracker O&M supply chain.
And potentially ways of managing those trackers that are good for nature or
Yeah.
potential for agricultural PV, but
Yeah,
we won't go into that.
more for agrivoltaics.
Yeah. All right. So Tris, internationally, what projects have you worked on that have benefited nature in novel or interesting ways?
Yeah, so we tend to get involved on individual projects in support of our national partners when they're particularly concerning projects where the level of impact is deemed to be potentially very, very serious. So one example would be we've supported our partner in Egypt, Nature Conservation Egypt. In Egypt, there are some really big wind resources on the Gulf of Suez. So we talk about onshore wind, consistent wind speeds of sort of 11, 12 meters per second, very, very good wind conditions. And actually a landscape which doesn't have a lot of intrinsic biodiversity value, except for the fact that this is the narrowest point on the Gulf of Suez where each spring and each autumn 1.5 million soaring birds from Europe and Asia cross into Africa and return every year in what is one of the largest bottlenecks of migration in the world. So these are soaring birds, eagles, vultures, storks, and these are birds that don't like to cross large water bodies. They use thermals to stay airborne. Thermals are less prevalent over water, so they find the narrowest point to cross, and that happens to be this one point on the Gulf of Suez. And the impact, and I say there's sort of 250,000 white storks pass through here every year. Most of the world's population of white storks. On a single day, you can have 100,000 birds pass over at this one spot. Because they're passing over water without thermals, they're losing height. So when they hit the Egyptian coast, they are at just the wrong height for turbines. So the impact would have been catastrophic, with many, many thousands of birds dying. What we did was we worked with the government, with the developers and with the lenders there to establish a system of observer-led shutdown of the turbines. So we helped train local people, and for 3 months in the spring, 3 months in the autumn, local people take up positions, vantage points throughout the turbine array, and they watch in the direction the birds come from, and when they see birds approaching and they believe there's going to be a collision, they phone the control center, they turn the turbine off, the birds move past, and then they start it up again. And these observers get incredibly good at knowing, well, one, first spotting birds and identifying them, but also anticipating when collisions are likely to happen, so that actually the amount of time that the turbines are turned off is very minimal and the loss of energy is very small. And it's been a huge success. The government is very pleased for it. It's been a way of finding employment for local people in an area where there's a lack of employment opportunities, and it's a very sought after job. They get paid for those 6 months of work, what would be really a year's worth salary in Egypt. The companies are very happy at being able to show that they've developed at such a large scale and to do so in a largely bird safe way. And you know, that pioneering system of using observers to shut down is now evolving into kind of systems that are camera based. So I work on an advisory panel for a wind farm in Uzbekistan where we've just installed a camera system. So there are about 30 cameras dotted around the turbine array. They monitor all of the turbines and they use artificial intelligence, artificial learning to identify the birds that they see approaching. So they're programmed to only shut down for a few target species. In this case, it's golden eagles, Egyptian vulture, a number of other eagles and vultures and falcons at this site. And the cameras can identify them, track them, and when they get within a certain distance of the turbines, they automatically turn off the turbines, and then they come back on when the birds move away. And I think we're probably moving, hopefully, to a world where most turbines will have some sort of inbuilt cameras or sensors that allow for collisions to be predicted, and either for turbines to shut down or for there to be some kind of mechanism for them to then sort of alert the birds, some sort of sound that might sort of get them to fly away. And we're starting to have those cameras working offshore as well, so we're starting to get them robust enough to work at sea. So there is, even in these really high risk areas, which solutions can be found when you get all the parties working together with the common goal of finding a solution.
So I was aware of software, and I'm sure other companies like Aecon probably have the same type of capability. But I do remember speaking with Natural Power back in the day, and they had ended up coming up, I think it was either they had come up with or they knew a turbine manufacturer. I'll try and make it more generic than it's possible. But to sense bats, because in the UK I've worked on projects where at dawn and dusk, if the wind speed is below a certain factor, the turbines had to shut off. Because bats relying on echolocation, if the turbine speed is high, then to a bat, that area looks solid. If the turbine speed is low and the revolutions are low, then the bats were flying into and hitting the blades. So the projects were getting planning permission, but on the condition that at certain wind speeds, the cut-in speed would be increased, and therefore it did have quite an impact on yield. What has since happened is the ability to detect when you have bats in the region or are coming towards the blade, and then the turbines can automatically go into the bunny position. But that has been one way, and that's certainly affecting projects in the UK, where we've got to think about the impact on bats and bat strike.
All right. Thanks. So we've talked a bit about mitigating the impact in the first place, a little bit about sort of novel, innovative solutions to nature-positive projects. But I wondered if the panel had thoughts on the obstacles to taking nature-positive actions on developments, or indeed what are the incentives? Because this comes at a cost for a developer. So what's sort of driving it?
So I'm going to jump in. I'm going to break the order.
Go
Rebel. I think there are already, since the introduction of the biodiversity net gain, since the inclusion at COP26 of nature, there was, in response, a proliferation of fund managers who came to market to seek commitments from investors to invest in nature. What has happened is that nature and nature investments have taken on a very big spectrum. There has been everything from forestry is now a nature investment. You have seen biodiversity net gain credits become an investment class similar to carbon credits. Carbon credits themselves are coming back as a nature type investment class. You're also seeing tech, whether it's vertical farms and or other, coming up again as a class of nature investment. So first I would say there has been a significant impetus from allocators of capital to invest. Now at that point, because I tend to think that the audience here are more like the developer world or consultant world, that means there is a bank of money that is willing to invest in a project on the basis of its nature credentials. The challenge when we're talking about electricity generation is that fundamentally the risk-return profile needs to be that of a solar project. Because to invest in nature is to lock up capital for a long period of time with a long obligation, but potentially not to have recurring revenues. So you only get to monetize a biodiversity net gain credit once, but you have to do the improvements and maintain them for 40 years. So if what we would then say, our approach, others have other approaches, and I'm not going to say one's right or wrong, our approach is to look to invest in a solar project, to look to invest in a synchronous condenser, a shunt reactor, a wind turbine, a battery project, because we feel comfortable assessing the risk-return profile, the revenue, the ability to get long-term contracted inflation-linked revenues to underwrite the project. But we intentionally, incrementally invest in the nature impact. So we do that because for us we're avoiding a cost. We know if we do not do any biodiversity improvement, we will face a fine or have to buy from the government's central reservation of units. Right? So by doing the intentional incremental investment, we seek to know that we will avoid a cost. There may be an economic upside. There's actually been quite a lot of debate whether projects that have gone into planning saying they'll deliver 60%, 30%, 70% can monetize any of that they have gone into planning to secure. Because if you go into planning saying I will deliver a 10% gain and I commit to that, but actually you deliver a 60% gain, you certainly can monetize the delta back down to what you plan to deliver in planning. But there is a very big grey area that if you told the planners you were going to deliver a 60-70% gain and then sought to sell that, whether you can, that is something that I have heard law firms starting to give advice upon. So what I would have said is, for us, when you're asking about how we intentionally invest, it is to avoid a certain cost, but to actually think about monetizing something that only has a value on an over-the-counter transaction with a very illiquid market, and there's so much uncertainty on the demand-supply balance, it's very hard to include that in your economic forecasts. I'm sure my other panelists had different opinions, but I just decided to jump in.
Yep.
Yeah, I can perhaps add a little bit to that. I mean, it sounded fair what you were saying, Rosalind, and I think from my experience working with the different developers, there are a lot of developers who don't build E&G into the financial model, so they're assuming, particularly if they wish to sell a site after it's got consent, for example, that a potential buyer may not put value on it. So it becomes interesting watching them develop it further. We've worked on some projects where they will go substantially above 10%, so you can't knock the developers, but they will cap it because it does cost them money in construction with the seed mix and during maintenance operation if they go far and beyond, let's say 60-80% or whatever they wish to achieve. So some of the developers we work for, they'll pick a number they're comfortable with in sort of their financial model, which is well above the 10%, but not reaching far a bit beyond. And that's partly because they don't have the confidence at the moment in that mechanism for buying and selling the B&G credits. There are developers as well. You touched on, I don't know whether you're specifically thinking about Tilbridge, but we worked on the Tilbridge project in Lincolnshire, and that was interesting because Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, they did turn around an examination and said, we don't want you to monetize the B&G. As a developer, are you happy? And that was Tribus Energy and Recurrent Energy. Are you happy to commit to not selling and making financial gain from any of the B&G. And interestingly they agreed to that because they said that's fine, it's not built into our financial model, we don't need to sell the B&G credits. I know other developers would take a very different opinion to that. So it's a little bit in flux at the moment. It's interesting watching that sort of the financial market play out in the B&G side.
There's been a lot of talk about how B&G has done a job of, at the very least, giving us a metric to be able to measure nature positive actions on a site or enhancements on a site in terms of habitat. But I wonder, internationally, BNG isn't a thing everywhere. What are the incentives and what are the obstacles to anyone helping nature outside of the UK?
No, it's not a thing everywhere, and it's almost universally not a thing. Indeed, on a global scale, many countries don't even have any legislation around renewable energy, any requirement for impact assessment, certainly not requirements for biodiversity net gain. That I think is that is the big obstacle. So we've heard these great examples of what's achieved in the UK, and I'm afraid, in other parts of the world that simply isn't the case. And some of the development elsewhere in the world is at such a huge scale. I mean, this year we'll see the largest renewable project to date open, a hybrid solar wind site in Gujarat in India. That's one site that is bigger than 5 Singapores put together, and there's no BNG there, or even environmental impact assessment, I can tell you. And and unfortunately, we see cases of primary rainforest being cleared, the topsoil then being scraped off to make it so that not a single bit of vegetation can regrow in order to put down solar panels. And that's, in some parts of the world, what is happening, as perverse as that would seem to us, that without those kind of regulations, you can get some really bad practice going on in the world. And I think that's why it's important to also say that we're talking about great examples here in the UK because of that legislative framework that exists. And the legislation that exists in places like the EU and the UK is important because it sets global standards. And that's why I think it's worrying to those of us who work on a global scale when we see potentially rolling back of environmental commitment in the EU and in the UK with suggestions being made that it's environmental consideration that is holding up planning or is a drag on development, because it is pointing to the UK and pointing to other leading European countries that we're able to start getting progress in other parts of the world. And it has a knock-on effect when we see kind of a rollback of standards here. So, my sort of plug to the UK renewable energy sector would to be to embrace these standards and actually, and although they can seem kind of arduous and they do sometimes lead to sort of perverse outcomes where you sort of feel like you're tick boxing unnecessarily, but I think it is on a global perspective, it's very important that countries like UK maintain high standards and are able to establish themselves as role models, because there is a trickle down that these things eventually end up as the sort of established best practice around.
So I would say to make that happen, we need to be better. Don't say it's because we should, say the economic benefit. Because when you were talking to me about bird strike, I was thinking damage to blades. So why would I, as a project sponsor, want people out there looking to mitigate bird strike and to put the blades in the bunny position? Because a bird-stricken blade is not efficient. That can cause damage, which means that you have to stop the machine and then go, it's a new blade, it's a serious amount of downtime, versus the length of time you'd have been down to just let that flock past. No, in economic terms, it is better to stop the machine for half a day and allow that migration than it is to have a unit not producing electricity for a substantial amount of time. Again, when it comes to you said about the grading of land for solar, now we need to start sharing the fact that impacts the watercourses. When it impacts the watercourses, you suddenly change how your site floods and responds to either pluvial and fluvial flooding risk. I can't remember which one is sort of a coastal and a flood and which one's rainfall, but I do know it's pluvial and fluvial flooding. That matters because once you have done the grading, the site won't drain water or flood or manage water the way it used to before you took your actions. And we've now found out at our projects in America where we don't do that, that the site, if you work with the natural camber of a site, and you allow for those natural watercourses from severe flooding, rainforest is not going to be dry, even I can work that one out, that you again get an economic benefit because you will be allowed to work with the natural camber of the site. And I think conveying these measures, not as we should do this because it just makes the world a nice place, but economically your project performance is more resilient. Economically, your project is more likely to get to 35, 40 years of cash flows if you do these steps. Your insurance will be cheaper if you do these steps. Your O&M will be cheaper if you do these steps, as well as your your performance and your top line's better. You will have more people coming with you, which is why I started by saying it's the economic impact of the loss of nature that we need to pay attention to, because that motivates people. If you think your 40-year project's only going to last 30 years because you've had too many instances of a bird strike, you're going to take steps to protect that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Another example I would give, you mentioned burial of power lines, and yeah, it is impossible to have that conversation with a grid operator in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. They simply see it as too expensive to consider undergrounding. But what I think may change that is a growing recognition that a root cause of a lot of the bushfires we're seeing in places like California could well be birds hitting power lines, bursting into flame and dropping down and igniting the ground below. There's studies in California that has been shown to be the origin of a lot of fires, and a lot of work is now ongoing in the States to try and find cheaper ways of digging trenches for underground cable, because they're desperate to get more cable underground because they're worried about the impacts of fires. And so, yes, I think it's going to be some of those other considerations that are going to help us drive towards making things like undergrounding more commonplace.
All right, thanks everyone. So I think we've got about 10 minutes left. So we might see if there are any questions from the floor. We do. Do we have a microphone person? You do? Yeah. Would you be able to come to the front here? I think it's good.
Yeah, I think it's working now. Thank you very much for the session. So I have a quick question for Rosalind. So you mentioned there's some challenge to monetize the BNG, but with more BNG being kind of implemented together with the renewable projects, do you think the price, the offtake who are paying for the power, there's kind of reflective of that in a way?
I have a live example of this. Thank you. Great question. We announced the UK's largest ever corporate PPA last year. So that was where we signed a corporate PPA with Tesco's for 65% of the power that we sold from Cleve Hill. We had negotiated for a long time. There was a big tender. How did we make our project stand out amongst the 20 plus other projects that were seeking to have Tesco's as an off-taker? We noticed their CEO come out with a big statement about nature, positivity of nature, the importance of nature, and at a time when they had gone a bit quiet and cold on us, it was a case of, right, we prepared a 4-page presentation on the biodiversity impacts at Cleve Hill. The bat breeding, the water vole hotels, the avian runways, the waterway improvements, and submitted that. And from then on, we were a go. And I cannot say, because of our biodiversity, we got a very strong PPA price with uncapped indexation for 15 years. But I can say we went from cold to being the project they were going to be buying from at a time when we said, we've read your CEO's statement and here's our biodiversity credentials.
Perfect. Were there any other questions? I think there's one at the back here. Do you have a microphone?
Microphone lady.
Oh, go on then.
Thanks very much. There have been some fascinating examples of the benefits expressed through a commercial lens. who's driving the narrative on that? Because so many of them were news to me. And is there any sort of industry move to try to raise public and also investor awareness of that? Because it really seems absent in the narrative that I've been exposed to.
Yes, it has been absent. I think the starting gun for me was the Glasgow Agreement, where nature became something that everybody suddenly signed up to, and it was like, yes, nature impact matters. It's then a case of stalk the research. Google and other search engines are your friend. And so I found the Oxford University study because Ben Caldecott, a former colleague, is at the Smith School and published it on his LinkedIn. And then suddenly I see it on my LinkedIn and I'm like, oh, hello, we're finally costing the economic impact of nature. That was on a global level. Then you start to see the rollout of the economic impact just to the UK. So it is coming. I would have said now it's also a bit of data gathering that is possible. We're able now to start quantifying the economic impact, and the research is coming. It does need to be part of industry. I would have said the other thing that needs to be part of industry is communicating the economic benefits of renewables. We all see the cost line on our bills, but we do not see the subsidy line from the new generation or new build CFD projects. And nobody knows that the CFD projects subsidised our electricity bills to the tune of 0.8 billion between Q4 21 and Q1 23. You hear renewables cost us, but you don't hear that when gas prices went high, renewables subsidised the bills. So that's actually just part of industry. We kind of know the good things that we do, but I think we need to become far better at communicating the economic impact.
And just to add to that, I spend a lot of my time nagging developers and giving them a hard time, but I think when they get things right, we should sort of ensure that they get acknowledged for that, and people do see that, and hopefully that can help bolster the arguments for renewables. So I would hope that the work that our partner the RSPB has recently done that shows that those solar facilities in southern England are a biodiversity gain will help combat some of the opposition that you get locally, where one of the arguments that will be given will be that there will be an impact on nature. And actually now you can point to published work with a UK conservation charity behind it that says, well, actually, these are actually improving the biodiversity of the area.
I just add on that last point, as the Trade Association for Solar Energy in the UK, we produce a report yearly on the biodiversity on solar farms, but grab me afterwards because I think I have to wrap up. So I'm just going to thank my panelists. Thank you very much. It was a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.